Let's go to the dealing room of FIG Securities now, though. We're going to have a word with Dr. Stephen Nash, particularly about that testimony that we've heard from Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens today. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. Look, there has been a lot of tongues wagging about this testimony. One of the words that's being bandied about is dovish. Would you agree that the statements that he was making were dovish?
Well, if we go back to the statement of monetary policy last week, that was a little bit on the hawkish side. However, if you read the statement in detail, there was a concern about the household sector, which was developed from the November statement. Now, I think what Stevens has done is effectively developed that a little bit more in the speech today. Again, we had the same old theme of mining growth and the problems that poses for inflation, but again, the household sector was mentioned, the caution there was mentioned, and I think the question going forward is, will that caution turn into consumer pessimism? I think that's an important theme.
And do you think that, the statement of monetary policy put together with the comments today will plant that seed, or, will consumers, knowing that interest rates are likely to stay on hold for some time now, if that could bring back some of this confidence?
Well, hopefully, the idea that rates are going to be on hold will condition consumers to be a little bit more optimistic, but I think even prior to the floods, there was a sense that the consumer was starting to fail. Now, we've had the floods have basically put a blackout on information. It's very difficult for the RBA to assess information for the next few months. So I think any information we get on the consumer going forward will be very carefully looked at. We've had a series of releases this week, the NAB survey, retail sales, among others, that just support this idea that there's an emerging theme going on with a weak consumer, and I think we have to watch that pretty carefully.
Moving on to global issues, just looking at this week, we did get the Chinese tightening interest rates, to end the Lunar New Year holiday. Do you think that we're sort of at risk of a hard landing there with this tightening, or it's actually been done pretty modestly, generally speaking?
Well, I think a hard landing is the last thing that the Chinese authorities really need or want or are designing their policy for. I imagine what they're doing is trying to engineer a reduction in growth so they can get a moderation in inflation. Now, that's going to be important for the RBA as well, because as we get this moderation of Chinese growth, it will put less pressure on the RBA to tighten going forward. It appears the RBA is pretty happy with the idea of possibly one more tightening this year, which is considerably lower to what the consensus was even a few weeks ago.
Do you think, though, that the Chinese should have actually moved more significantly, got another, why do they keep doing it in these little sort of bursts instead of just getting one good interest rate rise out there?
Well, I think the answer to that question is that they're very concerned about the idea of over-tightening, doing things too quickly, and thereby engineering a hard landing. I think they'll have a lot of difficulties if that is the case. A recession in China would not be conducive to a smooth operation of that economy. So I think that they're moving cautiously, but there's going to be more moves soon.
Also, looking overseas, we heard from Ben Bernanke again this week, seemingly lending some more credence to the fact that the economy is recovering. Of course, talking about unemployment and how it's stubbornly high. When we take the sort of bulk of comments from Ben Bernanke in the past month, say, or even just a couple of weeks. I mean, February 3rd, he was talking the economy down slightly. So, what do you make of his take on the economy? What sort of balls is he trying to toss in the air here?
Well, I think Bernanke is trying to resist calls to tighten at a time where, if he was to move, I think would damage the economy severely. You can just imagine if they were to move and there was a relapse or another recession as a result, the criticism that would be levelled at Bernanke. I think he's a scholar of what happened in the Depression era, and from that experience, he's learnt that tightening too early can be very damaging to a recovery. And I think they're very happy with the growing sentiment that's occurring, but I think the problem with the US bond market of late has been perceptions of unending supply, and I think the administration is starting to deal with those problems, and I think over time we're going to get the deficit addressed and less supply. So I imagine we'll get some rally in those US bonds at some stage.
Yeah, well, because Bernanke is hardly alone with his concern on the deficit. Is that really starting to ring some alarm bells in the US?
Look, the President is starting to move much more to the centre in terms of his politics, and is talking about cutting the deficit. I think this is the start of a move, and there will be more to come, and I think concerns about the deficit are probably overdone right now.
Okay, what are you sort of keeping your eye on as we head towards the close today and looking forward to next week? I mean, what do you think is really going to be setting the agenda in bonds?
Well, I think the issue will be this what's happening with the consumer, and any evidence we get of further declines in consumer sentiment, or what's going on with the housing market, for example, whether or not the clearance rate recovers from, say, 48% we recorded last week. Those sort of indicators are going to be very closely watched. I think the problem going forward for the government will be whether the consumer can maintain current spending levels, or whether they become even more conservative than they have been.
All right, well, we will be watching along with you. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. We appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Stephen Nash joining us from Fig.